Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is say no. Sometimes the greatest love story begins with someone willing to bleed for that choice. Freydis stood tied to the punishment post, her crime simple. She had refused to marry a man who disgusted her. The village watched as the overseer raised his whip for the final strike. Then a giant hand caught the leather mid-air. Bjorn had returned from war, scarred and weathered, but his eyes found hers across the crowd. "She's already taken," he said quietly. The villagers knew him as a warrior. They didn't know he had loved her since they were children. They didn't know he had carried her memory through every battle. What they were about to witness would shake their small world forever. But could love really triumph over a village's ancient customs and the fury of a rejected chieftain's son? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Hofstrand had stood for 3 generations, where the fjord met the fertile valley. Its wooden houses clustered like weathered barnacles around the great longhouse that served as both meeting hall and fortress. Smoke rose from countless hearths in the early morning air, carrying the scents of barley porridge and dried fish that spoke of simple, enduring lives built on the rhythm of seasons and the strength of tradition. Freydis Eriksdottir had known no other world than this. Yet she had never quite fit within its carefully drawn boundaries. At 22, she possessed her grandmother's gift for healing and her grandfather's stubborn streak that had once made him legendary among the old warriors. Her father, Eric the Wise, served as the village healer, a man respected for his gentle hands and vast knowledge of herbs. But it was Freydis who had inherited the true calling. Her healing pouch, a worn leather satchel that had belonged to 3 generations of healing women before her, never left her side. The soft leather bore the oils of countless remedies: wolfsbane for fever, willow bark for pain, honey and yarrow for wounds that refused to close. The villagers had learned to seek her out when their children burned with sickness or when the old warriors' bones ached with the memory of ancient battles. But healing was woman's work. And woman's work came with expectations that sat heavy on Freydis's shoulders like an ill-fitting cloak. She was past the age when most village daughters took husbands, a fact that Thorvald Ironbeard, the chieftain, mentioned with increasing frequency whenever their paths crossed. Thorvald ruled Hofstrand with the iron fist that his name suggested, a man who had survived 40 winters by bending others to his will and crushing those who would not bend. His son, Eirik Bloodaxe, had inherited his father's arrogance, but none of his wisdom. Where Thorvald was calculating, Eirik was impulsive. Where the father understood that true power came from respect, the son believed it flowed from fear. At 25, Eirik stood tall and broad-shouldered, with golden hair that caught the light and features that should have made him handsome. Yet there was something cold in his pale blue eyes. Something that made women step aside when he passed, and mothers pull their daughters closer. For 2 years, Eirik had pursued Freydis with the persistence of a hunter tracking wounded prey. His advances had grown bolder with each rejection, his gifts more expensive, his demands for acknowledgement more public. The silver arm ring he had offered her last spring was worth more than most families saw in a year, but Freydis had handed it back to him in front of half the village. A rejection as clear as a slap across his handsome face. "I do not wish to marry," she had said simply, her voice carrying across the market square where they stood. "Not you, not anyone chosen for me. When I take a husband, it will be by my own choice, in my own time." The gathered villagers had gasped at such boldness. Eirik's face had flushed red as fresh blood, but he had forced a laugh and claimed he admired her spirit. That had been 6 months ago. His admiration had since curdled into something darker. The village women whispered about Freydis behind their weaving, some with envy, others with concern. "She thinks herself above the rest of us," muttered Astrid, the blacksmith's wife, whose own marriage had been arranged when she was 16. "Pride comes before a fall, mark my words." But Freydis's closest friend, Sigrid, saw deeper truths. Sigrid had married for love 3 years past and understood the difference between choosing one's path and having it chosen. "She waits for someone worthy," Sigrid would say when the other women's tongues grew sharp. Better to wait a lifetime than spend one in misery. What none of them knew, what Freydis herself barely dared remember in the light of day, was that she was not waiting for someone worthy. She was waiting for someone specific, someone who might never return from the wars that had swallowed so many of their young men like a hungry sea. Bjorn Skallgrimsson had left Hovstrand 5 years ago, barely 18, and burning with the restless fire that drove young men to seek their fortunes with sword and shield. He had been the largest boy in the village even then, standing head and shoulders above his age mates, with arms like young tree trunks and a mind sharp enough to make the old warriors nod with approval when he spoke. But it was not his size or strength that had captured Freydis's heart in those sweet, stolen moments of their youth. It was the way he listened when she spoke of her dreams, the way he watched clouds move across the sky with the same intensity he brought to everything else, the way he could be fierce as a wolverine in defense of those he loved, and gentle as a summer breeze when tending a wounded bird. They had been inseparable as children, two souls who recognized something kindred in each other. While other boys played at war, Bjorn had helped her gather healing herbs in the deep woods. While other girls learned the elaborate dance of courtship, Freydis had listened to Bjorn's dreams of seeing the great cities beyond the northern seas. The night before he left, they had met in the sacred grove where their ancestors had worshipped the old gods for 1,000 years. The ancient oak trees stood like cathedral pillars around them, their branches forming a canopy that filtered moonlight into silver coins scattered across the forest floor. "I will come back," he had promised, his young voice already deepening toward manhood. "Whatever fortune I find, whatever battles I fight, I will come back for you, and I will wait," she had whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "But not forever, Bjorn Skallgrimsson. If you die with strangers in a foreign land, I will mourn you and then choose my own path." He had laughed at that, the sound rich and warm in the cool night air. "Fair enough, Freydis Eriksdottir. But I do not plan to die anywhere but in this village, old and grey. With you beside me and grandchildren climbing on my knees." They had kissed then, sweet and solemn, sealing a promise that felt more binding than any marriage vow spoken before the village council. That had been 5 years ago. In that time, word had come sporadically of his adventures. He had sailed with the great chieftain Rurik down the river routes to Constantinople, where gold flowed like water, and the emperor of the Romans paid handsomely for northern warriors to guard his throne. Later, merchants brought tales of a giant Viking who had earned fame fighting the horse lords of the eastern steppes, a man they called the Bone Crusher for his terrible skill with the warhammer. But fame was a double-edged sword. The greater Bjorn's reputation grew, the more distant he seemed from the boy who had helped her collect elderberries and promised to return. Freydis had learned to guard her heart against hope, to live each day as if he would never come home, even as some stubborn part of her refused to let go entirely. Her father, Eric, had watched his daughter's careful balance between hope and resignation, with the keen eye of a man who had seen many sorrows in his years of healing. He understood her refusal to marry Eric Bloodaxe, though he worried about the consequences. Thorvald was not a man to accept defiance lightly, and his son had inherited a vindictive streak that made him dangerous when thwarted. "You cannot wait forever, daughter," Eric had said gently just the week before, as they worked together, preparing poultices for the winter ailments that would soon visit every household. "Bjorn may have found a new life in distant lands. Warriors often do." "I know, father," Freydis had replied, grinding yarrow leaves with perhaps more force than necessary. "But I will not marry to ease other people's discomfort with my choices. If Bjorn has forgotten his promises, then I will make my own way. There are worse fates than remaining unmarried." Eric had nodded, though lines of worry creased his weathered face. He knew his daughter's strength, but he also knew the forces arrayed against her. Thorvald had grown increasingly impatient with what he saw as Freydis's defiance of natural order. A woman of her age should be bearing children, strengthening the clan, fulfilling her duty to the community that had raised her. The chieftain's patience had finally reached its end 3 days ago when Eric made his formal proposal before the village council, offering a bride price generous enough to make even the most prosperous families envious. When Freydis rose to speak, her voice clear and unwavering as she refused him once again, Thorvald's face had darkened like a storm cloud. "You dishonor my son and mock our customs," he had declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "If you will not choose the path of a proper woman, then perhaps you need reminding of what defiance costs." The sentence had been swift and traditional, 10 lashes for bringing shame upon a worthy suitor and disrupting the peace of the community. It was an old punishment rarely used in recent years, but still recognized as lawful under the ancient codes that governed their people. Freydis had accepted the judgment with dignity that impressed even her critics. She would not beg, would not recant her refusal to appease them. If they demanded she pay in blood for the right to choose her own fate, then blood she would give. But as she stood now in the village square, her hands bound to the worn oak post that had witnessed generations of punishments, she wondered if her courage would prove equal to her convictions. The rough wood bit into her palms, and she could feel the weight of every gaze upon her. Some faces showed sympathy, others righteousness, most simply the grim fascination that drew people to witness both justice and suffering. The overseer, a grizzled man named Gunnar, who had carried out such sentences for 20 years, checked the leather whip with professional efficiency. He was not cruel by nature, but neither would he soften the punishment out of misplaced mercy. 9 lashes had already painted stripes of fire across her back. 1 remained. Freydis closed her eyes and thought of the sacred grove, of moonlight and promises, of a young man who had sworn to return. Whether Bjorn kept his word or not, whether he still lived or had died with honor in some distant land, she would face this final lash as she had lived, with her head high and her choices her own. The whip whistled through the air, and the world held its breath. The massive hand that caught Gunnar's whip belonged to a man the villagers barely recognized, though his name had echoed through their halls for years. Bjorn Skallgrimsson stood like a mountain given human form, broader and taller than when he had left, his shoulders bearing the weight of battles fought in distant lands. Scars mapped stories across his arms and neck, and his once golden beard now carried threads of premature grey. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had haunted Freydis's dreams, remained unchanged as they found hers. Across the silent square, "She's already taken," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The leather whip hung slack in his grip, its purpose forgotten in the face of this unexpected intervention. Gunnar stepped back, uncertain. 20 years of carrying out sentences had not prepared him for this moment. The law was clear, the punishment decreed, but the man before him was Bjorn the Bone Crusher, whose reputation had grown with each merchant's tale. Even Gunnar, who feared little in this world, felt the weight of that legendary presence. Eric Bloodaxe pushed through the crowd, his handsome face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You dare interfere with lawful punishment?" He snarled, his hand moving instinctively to the sword at his hip. This woman refused an honorable proposal. She chose shame over duty. Bjorn's gaze shifted to Eirik, with the lazy attention of a wolf noting a yapping dog. "I see no shame here," he replied calmly. "Only a woman brave enough to choose her own path, and men small enough to punish her for it." The insult hit its mark. Eirik's face flushed red as fresh blood, and murmurs rippled through the gathered villagers. No one spoke to the chieftain's son with such casual dismissal, certainly not in public, certainly not in a way that made him appear foolish before the very people he sought to rule. "You've been gone 5 years, Eirik spat, stepping closer, despite the obvious difference in their size. "This village follows our laws, not the whims of wandering mercenaries." 5 years. Bjorn agreed, his tone conversational as he began unwinding the whip from around his massive fist. Long enough to learn that some laws serve justice, while others serve only the powerful. Long enough to see how real men treat their women in lands where strength is measured by protection, not domination. Thorvald Ironbeard finally pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his weathered face calculating as he assessed this unexpected complication. The chieftain had survived 4 decades by knowing when to fight and when to negotiate, and the man before him represented a threat that required careful handling. "Bjorn Skullgrimson," Thorvald said, his voice carrying formal authority. "You returned to Hovstrand after long absence. We welcome a proven warrior home, but you interfere with justice lawfully decreed by the village council." "Do I?" Bjorn asked, finally letting the whip fall to the ground. "I see no justice here, Thorvald. I see an old man using ancient laws to force a free woman into his son's bed, because she has the courage to refuse him." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Round the square, villagers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in grudging agreement, others scandalized by such directness. Freydis remained silent at the punishment post, hardly daring to breathe as the confrontation unfolded. "You speak of matters you do not understand," Thorvald replied, his own temper beginning to show. "Freydis Eriksdottir is past the age of marriage. She disrupts the order of our community with her defiance. My son offered honorable terms, a generous bride price, a union that would strengthen both families, and she refused," Bjorn said simply. "As is her right as a free woman of the North. Or have we become so weak in 5 years that we must force our women to accept husbands they despise?" Eric could contain himself no longer. "She belongs to no man," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "She has no protector, no family strong enough to refuse a fair offer. The law supports my claim, no protector." Bjorn's laugh was soft and dangerous. "That's where you're wrong, boy." He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, crossing the distance to the punishment post in 3 long strides. With gentle hands that had once crushed enemy skulls, he began untying the ropes that bound Freydis. His fingers brushed against her wrists as he worked, and she felt the calluses earned in foreign wars, the strength that could break iron, the tenderness he reserved for things he treasured. "Freydis Eriksdottir has been under my protection since we were children," he announced to the crowd as the last rope fell away. "Before I left for the eastern lands, we pledged ourselves to each other in the sacred grove, before the old gods, who still watch over those brave enough to honor true love." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembly. Some gasped in surprise, others nodded as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Sigrid, Freydis's closest friend, smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Freydis turned to face Bjorn fully for the first time, her back still burning from 9 lashes, but her heart soaring with joy and relief she had not allowed herself to feel in years. He was changed, harder, scarred, carrying the weight of experiences she could barely imagine, but the man who looked down at her with infinite gentleness was still the boy who had promised to return. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "I promised I would," he replied, just as quietly. "Though I see I returned not a moment too soon." Eric's rage had reached a breaking point that made rational thought impossible. "Pledges made in secret hold no weight under law," he declared, drawing his sword with a ring of steel. "If you claim her, then prove it with your blade." The challenge hung in the air like a thunderclap. Around the square, hands moved to weapons as the tension escalated beyond words, into the realm where honor was written in blood. Bjorn's own hand found the handle of the massive warhammer slung across his back, a weapon that had earned his terrible reputation in a dozen foreign campaigns. But Thorvald raised his hand before violence could erupt. "Enough!" the chieftain commanded, his voice cutting through the building chaos. "This matter has grown beyond simple punishment. If there are competing claims to Freydis Eriksdottir, they will be heard properly by the full village council, not decided by bloodshed in the market square." It was a strategic retreat, Bjorn realized. Thorvald needed time to think, to plan, to find a way to turn this situation to his advantage. The chieftain had not held power for 20 years by making rash decisions in moments of crisis. 3 days, Thorvald continued. Let all parties prepare their cases. Let witnesses be called. Let the village decide according to law and custom which claim holds the greater weight. Bjorn nodded slowly, recognizing both the wisdom and the trap in the proposal. 3 days would give him time to establish his position, but it would also give his enemies time to marshal their forces and find ways to undermine him. Agreed, he said formally. But Freydis Eriksdottir remains under my protection until the matter is resolved. Any who seek to harm or coerce her will answer to me personally. The promise carried the weight of a man who had never broken his word, and the threat of violence from someone capable of delivering it. Even Eirik, for all his fury, was not fool enough to test such a declaration immediately. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement over the unexpected drama, Bjorn gently placed his cloak around Freydis's shoulders. The wool was rough but warm, smelling of distant seas and foreign campfires, and she pulled it close as much for comfort as protection. Come, he said softly. Let's get those wounds tended properly. As they walked away together, neither noticed Erik's pale eyes following their every step, or the way his fingers tightened around his sword hilt until his knuckles showed. White as bone, the silver arm ring Erik had offered Freydis months ago, the symbol of his wealth and supposed generosity, lay forgotten in the dust of the market square, a glittering reminder that some things could not be bought, no matter how high the price. Erik the Wise waited in his modest dwelling with the patience of a man who had learned that healing required time above all else. When Bjorn carried his daughter through the doorway, the healer's trained eye immediately assessed both the obvious wounds on her back and the less visible damage that 5 years of waiting could inflict on a heart. Set her here, on her stomach, Erik instructed, indicating the low wooden table where he performed his most delicate work. The wounds are not deep, but they need proper cleaning to prevent festering. Bjorn's war hammer rested against the wall near the door, its iron head scarred from countless battles. The weapon seemed almost alive in the flickering candlelight, a reminder of the violence he had mastered in foreign lands. Yet his massive hands moved with surprising gentleness as he helped Freydis settle on the table, careful not to jar her injured back. I should have been here, he said quietly, his voice thick with guilt as Erik began cleaning the whip marks with practiced efficiency. I should never have left you to face this alone. You couldn't have known, Freydis replied, though she winced, as her father's gentle ministrations awakened fresh pain. Erik's pursuit only became truly aggressive this past year. Before that, he was content to make his intentions known and wait. What changed? Bjorn asked, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. His storm-grey eyes never left. Her face, as if he were memorizing every detail after years of carrying only memories. Erik paused in his work, exchanging a meaningful glance with his daughter. Thorvald grew impatient, the healer said carefully. Political pressures from neighboring villages, questions about succession, the need to secure alliances through marriage. Erik is his only son, and an unmarried heir suggests weakness to other chieftains. So they decided to force the issue, Bjorn concluded, his jaw tightening with controlled anger. Use the old laws to break her will when gentle persuasion failed. It might have worked on another woman, Freydis admitted, her voice muffled by the table's surface. But I learned stubbornness from my grandfather, who once told a king's messenger that true Vikings bow to no one but the gods. Bjorn's laugh was soft, but genuine. I remember old Magnus. He would have been proud to see you today, standing defiant even with your back bleeding. The bleeding is nearly stopped, Erik announced, applying a salve that smelled of honey and healing herbs. These wounds will heal clean if kept properly dressed. but the larger wound, the one to our community's peace that will take more time and wisdom to mend. As if summoned by the healer's words, voices rose outside the dwelling. Through the small window, they could see villagers gathering in excited clusters, their animated discussions carrying the energy of a community suddenly forced to examine long-held assumptions. Word spreads quickly in Hovstrand, Eric observed, beginning to wind clean linen around his daughter's torso. By sunset, every soul in the village will know of your pledge to each other. How are they taking it? Freydis asked, trying to read the mood of the distant conversations. Bjorn rose and moved to the window, his imposing frame blocking much of the light. Mixed reactions, he reported after a moment of careful observation. Some seem pleased, others troubled. The older women are clustered around Astrid, and her face suggests she's not sharing happy thoughts. Astrid believes any unmarried woman past 20 is a threat to the natural order, Eric said with a slight smile. She's been predicting your downfall since you refused your first suitor at 16. And the men? Freydis prompted. Harder to read, Bjorn admitted. Some nod when they look toward this house, others shake their heads. Your friend Sigrid seems to be defending you quite vigorously against a group of matrons. Freydis attempted to sit up as her father finished the bandaging, moving carefully to avoid disturbing his work. 3 days, she murmured, the weight of Thorvald's deadline settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. 3 days to convince an entire village that love should matter more than politics. It's not the village we need to convince, Bjorn said, turning from the window to face her directly. It's the council, Thorvald, the village elders, the heads of the most prominent families, men who've built their power on the assumption that tradition serves their interests. Eric secured the last of the bandages and stepped back to examine his work. There's something else you both need to understand, he said, his tone growing serious. This isn't really about marriage customs or ancient pledges. It's about Thorvald's authority. If he allows Freydis to defy his son successfully, other young people might begin questioning where his power ends and their freedom begins. The truth of those words settled over them like a cold wind. This personal conflict had become a symbol of larger tensions between individual choice and communal authority, between old ways and new possibilities. Then we make our case carefully, Bjorn said, settling back into his chair. We show respect for tradition while demonstrating that our pledge predates Eric's claim. We appeal to the romantic hearts that beat even in the chests of stern counsellors. Romance may not be enough, Freydis warned. Thorvald is a practical man. He'll argue that Eric offers security, prosperity, a strong alliance. What can you offer that compares to the chieftain's son? Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he weighed his words. 5 years of war have taught me things I never wanted to know, he said finally. I've seen cities burn, and good men die for causes they barely understood. I fought alongside princes and thieves, learned the price of loyalty and the cost of betrayal. He paused, his scarred hands clenching and unclenching as memories surfaced. But I've also learned that the strongest fortress means nothing if the heart inside it is empty. I've seen wealthy lords who owned everything except the love of their families, powerful warriors who died alone because they confused fear with respect. What are you saying? Freydis asked gently. I'm saying that I can offer you something Eric never could, Bjorn replied, meeting her eyes with absolute certainty. A partnership built on choice rather than obligation. A life where your gifts as a healer are honored, where your voice carries weight in our household decisions. I've seen the world beyond Hovstrand, and in all my travels, I never met a woman as wise or brave as the one sitting before me. The simple honesty in his words carried more weight than any grand gesture could have managed. Eric nodded approvingly, recognizing the deep respect that lay beneath the declaration. Pretty words, Freydis said, though her smile robbed the comment of any sting. But Thorvald will want to know about practical matters. Will you stay in Hovstrand or seek new adventures? How will you support a family? What position will you take in the village hierarchy? All fair questions, Bjorn acknowledged. And ones I'll answer honestly before the council. I have gold enough from my campaigns to establish a household. My reputation as a warrior brings honor to the village. And I have no desire to wander anymore. I've found what I was searching for all along. Outside, the voices were growing louder as more villagers joined the impromptu gatherings. The news of Bjorn's return and his dramatic intervention had awakened something in Hovstrand, a sense that change was possible even in a place where tradition held such power. But not all change was welcome, and not all who heard the news celebrated it. In the great longhouse, Thorvald and his son were already planning their response to this unexpected challenge to their authority. The next morning brought autumn's first frost to Hovstrand, coating the thatched roofs in silver and turning puddles into mirrors that reflected a sky the color of old pewter. Freydis woke in her childhood bed, her back still tender, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. The sound of quiet conversation from the main room told her that Bjorn had kept his promise to remain close. She found him sitting with her father at the rough wooden table, both men hunched over steaming bowls of porridge, like conspirators planning a campaign, which she realized as she caught fragments of their discussion was not far from the truth. The key is showing continuity, Eric was saying as she entered. Our customs honor pledges made before witnesses, even informal ones. If we can establish that your promise was witnessed by the gods themselves in the sacred grove, it carries legal weight. Bjorn looked up as Freydis approached, his eyes automatically checking her movement for signs of pain. How do you feel? He asked, rising to help her settle onto the bench beside him. Like I've been whipped, she replied with dry humor, accepting the bowl of porridge he offered. But alive, which is more than I expected yesterday morning. Her father's expression grew thoughtful. There's something we need to discuss, he said carefully. Something about your mother's wedding ring. Freydis paused with the spoon halfway to her mouth. Her mother had died when she was 12, a victim of the wasting sickness that sometimes took even the strongest women. The simple iron band her mother had worn, a ring forged by her grandfather from metal taken from a fallen star, had been placed with her in the burial mound according to custom. I know what you're thinking, Eric continued, but yesterday, after you both left for the healing, I went to the sacred grove. I wanted to pray for guidance, to ask the old gods for wisdom in these troubled times. He paused, his weathered hands wrapped around his bowl, as if drawing warmth from it. I found something there, buried beneath the great oak, where you two made your pledges. Something that should have been buried with your mother, but somehow remained behind. From beneath his tunic, he drew out a simple band of dark iron, its surface polished smooth by years of wear. The ring seemed to capture the firelight and hold it, glowing with an inner warmth that spoke of love freely given and faithfully kept. I don't understand, Freydis whispered, reaching out to touch the metal with trembling fingers. How could this be here? I saw it placed on her finger before the burial stones were set. The gods work in ways we don't always comprehend, Eric replied gently. Perhaps they preserved it for this moment when its meaning would matter most. Your mother always said that true love leaves echoes in the world, marks that outlast even death. Bjorn studied the ring with the reverence of a man who had learned to recognize the sacred in unexpected places. May I? He asked, and when Freydis nodded, he lifted the band and examined it closely. The metal was warm to his touch, and he could see the subtle patterns hammered into its surface by hands that had loved the woman who would wear it. It's beautiful, he said simply. Simple and strong like the love it represents. It could be important for the council hearing, Eric suggested. Physical proof that the gods smile on your union. Thorvald respects the old ways, even when they inconvenience him. Freydis accepted the ring back, slipping it onto the fourth finger of her right hand, where it settled as if it had never left. The metal seemed to pulse with warmth, and she felt a strange sense of completeness, as if a missing piece of her soul had finally returned home. Tell me about the wars, she said to Bjorn. needing to understand the man he had become during their years apart. "Tell me what changed you, what you've seen that I should know." Bjorn was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant as memories surfaced. "I've seen the great city of Constantinople, where the emperor's palace holds more gold than all the northern kingdoms combined. I've fought horse lords on the endless steppes, where the grass grows so tall it can hide an army. I've sailed rivers that flow backward and walked through forests where the trees grow so thick that noon feels like twilight." He paused, his scarred hands turning his own bowl in slow circles. "But mostly, I've learned that wealth without purpose is emptiness, that power without love is tyranny, and that no adventure means anything if you have no one to share it with when you come home." "You carry darkness in you now," Freydis observed gently. "I can see it behind your eyes. What happened out there that still haunts you?" The question touched something deep in Bjorn's chest, a wound that had never properly healed. "I killed men who probably had families waiting for them," he said quietly. "Good men, most of them, following leaders they trusted into battles that served causes they didn't understand. I became skilled at ending lives, and that skill brought me gold and reputation. But it also showed me the true cost of violence." Eric nodded with the understanding of a healer who had seen what war did to the souls of those who survived it. "That's why you stopped the whipping so gently," he realized. "You could have hurt Gunnar, disarmed him with force, but you chose restraint. Violence should be the last resort, not the first," Bjorn agreed. "I've had enough of unnecessary bloodshed, but I won't hesitate to use it if someone threatens what I love." Outside, the sounds of village life were beginning to stir. They could hear children's voices calling to each other, the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith's forge, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture. Normal sounds of a normal day, yet underneath it all ran an undercurrent of tension that spoke of a community holding its breath. "I should make my rounds," Freydis said, rising carefully from the bench. "People will be expecting their healer to appear unbroken by yesterday's events, and I need to gauge the mood of the village, see who stands with us and who against." "I'll come with you," Bjorn offered. But she shook her head. "Your presence would change how people speak to me," she explained. "Let me go alone this first time. I need to hear their honest thoughts, not the words they think a legendary warrior wants to hear." Bjorn understood, though every instinct honed by years of warfare urged him to protect her. "Be careful," he said instead. "Eric won't challenge me directly, but he might try to pressure you when I'm not present." "Let him try," Freydis replied, her mother's ring catching the firelight as she reached for her healing pouch. "I faced his father's whip without breaking. I think I can handle his wounded pride." As she stepped into the crisp morning air, the village spread before her like a familiar tapestry suddenly shot through with new threads. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. The question now was whether that change would strengthen the fabric of their community or tear it apart completely. The great longhouse of Hovstrand had witnessed countless gatherings over the generations, but none quite like the one that convened on the second day after Bjorn's dramatic return. The high seat, an ornate chair carved from a single massive oak and inlaid with silver that caught the firelight like captured stars, dominated the far end of the hall where Thorvald held court. The chair itself was a work of art, its arms shaped like prowling wolves, and its back rising nearly to the ceiling in a display of carved ravens that seemed to watch the proceedings with ancient wisdom. The village council filled the long benches that flanked the central fire pit, their faces grave as they contemplated the unprecedented situation before them. Never in living memory had such a fundamental challenge been raised to the established order of marriage and authority. The air thrummed with tension thick enough to taste. Thorvald Ironbeard sat in the high seat with the bearing of a man who had never doubted his right to rule. At 53, he remained imposing despite the grey that streaked his beard and the lines that mapped decades of difficult decisions across his weathered face. His pale blue eyes, so like his son's but tempered by wisdom and cunning, surveyed the assembled villagers with the calculating gaze of a chess master planning several moves. Ahead, "We gather to hear claims regarding Freydis, Eric's daughter," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "The matter touches on ancient laws, sacred customs, and the very foundation of order within our community." Eric sat to his father's right, his handsome features composed, but his hands betraying his agitation as they constantly shifted position on his knees. He had spent the previous day rallying support among the younger warriors and the families whose prosperity depended on Thorvald's favor, building a coalition of voices that would speak for tradition and authority. "Let Eirik Bloodaxe present his claim first," Thorvald continued, "as his suit was formally registered before this council and witnessed by all." Eric rose with practiced grace, his golden hair catching the firelight as he turned to address the assembled villagers. "Noble kinsman," he began, his voice carrying the trained resonance of a man born to command, "I come before you not in anger, but in grief. Grief that our customs, the very laws that have kept our people strong for generations, are now questioned by those who would place personal desire above communal good." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others uncertain. Astrid, the blacksmith's wife, nodded vigorously, while Sigrid crossed her arms and scowled at the speaker. "I offered Freydis, Eric's daughter, an honorable marriage," Eirik continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme. "A generous bride price that would secure her father's old age, a position of respect as wife to the chieftain's heir, and the promise of children who would carry forward the bloodlines that have made Hovstrand strong." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his central argument. "She refused these gifts not once, but repeatedly, showing contempt for our ways and disrespect for the man who would be your future leader. Such defiance, left unchecked, threatens the very foundation of our society." Bjorn remained seated during this speech, his massive frame relaxed but alert, like a great bear that appears to sleep but misses nothing. He had learned patience in the Eastern campaigns, where rushing into battle without proper reconnaissance led to disaster. "Now comes a stranger," Eric said, his voice taking on a sharper edge as he gestured toward Bjorn, "a man who left our village as a boy and returns as a foreign warrior, claiming ancient rights that were never formally recognized by this council. He speaks of secret pledges and hidden promises, but where are the witnesses? Where are the tokens of betrothal? Where is the proof that his claims hold weight under our laws?" The question struck home with several council members, their weathered faces showing uncertainty as they considered the legal implications. Marriage law among their people was complex, built on precedent and custom rather than written codes, and the intersection of personal pledges with formal procedures created grey areas that could be interpreted many ways. "I ask you," Eric concluded, spreading his arms wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire assembly, "which serves our people better? A marriage that strengthens our leadership and honors our traditions, or one that rewards defiance and elevates foreign ways above the wisdom of our ancestors?" He sat down to scattered applause, mostly from the older villagers and those whose positions depended on maintaining the status quo. Thorvald nodded approvingly at his son's performance, recognizing the skillful way Eric had framed the issue as a choice between order and chaos, rather than a simple dispute over one woman's heart. "Bjorn Skallgrimsson," Thorvald called, his voice carrying a note of challenge, "you may present your counterclaim." Bjorn rose slowly, his height making him tower over even the seated villagers. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, carrying the authority of a man who had faced down enemies in a dozen foreign courts. "Honored kinsman," he began, "I returned to Hovstrand not as a stranger, but as a son of this soil who has seen much of the world beyond our fjord. In my travels, I have served princes and fought beside kings, learned the customs of distant peoples and the wisdom of foreign lands." He paused, his grey eyes sweeping across the assembled faces. "But in all my wandering, I never forgot the promises made in youth under the sacred oak. Never stopped carrying the memory of a young woman whose courage and wisdom outshone all the treasures I saw in foreign courts. The romantic appeal was calculated but genuine, and several of the women in the audience exchanged meaningful glances. Even some of the men shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own young loves and the promises they had made when the world seemed full of possibility. Eric speaks of tradition, Bjorn continued, but he ignores the oldest tradition of all, that love freely given and faithfully kept is sacred to the gods themselves. He offers Freydis wealth and position, but these are poor substitutes for the respect and partnership that should mark a true union. Pretty words, interrupted Gunnar the overseer, his scarred face skeptical. But what proof do you offer of these alleged pledges? What tokens of betrothal? What witnesses to your claims? Bjorn smiled slightly, reaching into his travel pack to withdraw a small object wrapped in soft leather. I offer this, he said, unfolding the cloth to reveal a simple wooden carving, two ravens intertwined in flight, their wings forming a circle that had no beginning and no end. I carved this myself during my first winter of exile, he explained, holding it up so all could see. From wood taken from the sacred oak where Freydis and I pledged our hearts. The ravens represent our souls, bound together for all time, flying as one despite the distances that separate them. The symbolism was powerful and culturally resonant, but Eric was not finished fighting. Trinkets and tokens, he scoffed, rising to his feet again. Any man could carve such a thing and claim it represents ancient promises. Where are the human witnesses? What elder blessed this supposed union? The challenge hung in the air like a sword suspended over Bjorn's claim. Without living witnesses to their youthful pledge, his case relied entirely on faith and sentiment, powerful forces, but ones that might not sway a council focused on legal precedent and political stability. The ancient runestone stood where it had for countless generations in the sacred grove beyond Hovstrand, its weathered surface bearing symbols carved by hands that had turned to dust before the first Viking ship ever touched foreign shores. The stone rose from the earth like a finger pointing toward the gods, its granite face marked with runes that spoke of oaths sworn and promises kept. Moss clung to its base, and the great oak trees that surrounded it whispered secrets in the evening wind. Freydis knelt before the stone as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, her fingers tracing the ancient marks while Bjorn stood watch nearby. They had come here after the council session, seeking the peace that only this sacred place could provide and the guidance that sometimes came to those who knew how to listen. My grandmother brought me here when I was 7, Freydis said softly, her voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves. She taught me to read the old runes, showed me where her own grandmother had sworn her wedding vows under these same trees. Bjorn approached slowly, his massive frame moving with careful reverence in this place where the gods still walked among mortals. What do the stones say? He asked, settling beside her on the soft earth. They speak of promises that bind the soul, she replied, her fingers finding symbols that seemed to glow with inner light. Of oaths sworn before the All-Father himself, of love that endures beyond death and time. Look here, this mark represents eternal bonding, and this one speaks of protection given freely to the beloved. The runestone had witnessed thousands of such moments over the centuries. Lovers seeking the blessing of forces older than memory. Warriors pledging their lives to causes greater than personal glory. Its presence transformed the grove into a cathedral where the divine touched the mortal world. Do you think they heard us that night 5 years ago? Bjorn asked, remembering the young man he had been, burning with dreams of adventure and glory. When we made our promises under these branches? I know they did, Freydis answered with quiet certainty. The evidence lies in your return, in the perfect timing that brought you home just as the whip was falling. Some might call it coincidence, but I know the hand of fate when I see it. As if summoned by their words, an owl called from the darkness beyond the clearing, its voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. Both of them turned toward the sound, remembering childhood tales of the All-Father's ravens and the messages they carried between the worlds of gods and men. "The council session troubled you," Freydis observed, reading the tension in Bjorn's shoulders. "Eric's arguments found fertile ground among the elders." Bjorn nodded grimly. "He's cleverer than I gave him credit for, framing our love as a threat to tradition, making my absence seem like abandonment rather than necessity. And Thorvald, he lets his son speak while keeping his own counsel, waiting to see which way the wind blows." "What did you think of Gunnar's challenge about witnesses?" Freydis asked. "He seemed to carry weight with the other men." "Gunnar is honest but narrow," Bjorn replied. "He sees only what law allows, not what justice demands. But his point about witnesses troubles me. Without someone to speak for our pledge, we're asking the council to take faith over facts." Freydis was quiet for a long moment, her hand absently touching the iron ring on her finger. "There was someone," she said finally. "Someone who knew about our promises that night." Bjorn turned sharply to look at her. "Who?" Old Ragnhild, Freydis whispered. "She was gathering night-blooming herbs for her potions when we met here. I saw her in the shadows between the trees, thought she was a spirit at first. But she nodded to me as we left, and the next morning she gave me a bundle of healing herbs with a knowing smile." Hope flared in Bjorn's chest like a sudden flame. Ragnhild the Wise Woman was ancient even by village standards, old enough to remember when the current customs were new innovations. Her word carried the weight of decades, and her reputation for seeing hidden truths made her testimony nearly unassailable. "She still lives?" he asked urgently. "Still dwells in her cottage by the marshland?" "As far as I know," Freydis confirmed, "though she's grown strange in recent years, speaking in riddles and communing with spirits that others cannot see. Some say her mind wanders, that age has stolen her wits, or perhaps age has given her clearer sight," Bjorn suggested. "The very old sometimes see truths that escape the rest of us. We should visit her tomorrow, before the final council session." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drawing strength from each other's presence and from the sacred ground beneath them. The runestone seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, as if the ancient gods approved of their determination to fight for love against the forces of political convenience. "I've been thinking about what happens after," Freydis said eventually. "If the council rules in our favor, if we're allowed to marry, what then? Eric won't simply accept defeat, and Thorvald has too much invested in his son's success to let the matter rest." Bjorn had been wrestling with the same concerns. "We'll face that challenge when it comes," he said. "But I won't live in fear of what Eric might do. I've learned that bullies grow stronger when good people choose silence over courage." "You've changed," Freydis observed, studying his profile in the gathering darkness. "The boy who left was brave but reckless. The man who returned weighs his words like a merchant counts gold." "War teaches harsh lessons," Bjorn replied. "I've seen what happens when passion overwhelms wisdom, when the need for victory blinds warriors to the cost of winning. But I've also learned that some things are worth any price. Home, family, the love of someone who sees your soul clearly and chooses to stay." As they rose to leave the sacred grove, neither noticed the figure watching from the deeper shadows of the wood. Eric Bloodaxe had followed them at a distance, hoping to find some weakness he could exploit, some secret that might turn the village against them. What he had heard instead filled him with a cold rage that burned like winter fire. Their love was real, blessed by forces beyond his understanding or control. No amount of political maneuvering would change that fundamental truth, and the realization made him dangerous in ways that even Bjorn's warrior instincts had not anticipated. The runestone stood silent witness as the three figures departed. Two lovers walking hand in hand toward an uncertain future, and one bitter soul plotting revenge in the darkness behind them. The ancient symbols carved in granite had seen such dramas played out countless times over the centuries. Love and hate locked in eternal struggle while the gods watched and occasionally intervened. Old Ragnhild's cottage crouched at the edge of the marshland like a creature of moss and shadow, its walls thick with age and its roof heavy with the weight of countless seasons. Smoke drifted from the central, chimney in lazy spirals that seemed to carry more than a warmth, whispers of ancient knowledge and secrets that predated the village itself. When Bjorn and Freydis approached through the morning mist, they found the wise woman waiting for them, her blind eyes somehow tracking their movement with unsettling accuracy. She sat on a rough wooden stool beside her door, her gnarled hands sorting dried herbs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the task for decades. "I wondered when you would come," Ragnhild said before either could speak. Her voice carried the dry rasp of autumn leaves, yet underneath lay a strength that suggested her apparent frailty was partly illusion. "The stones told me of your need 3 nights past." Freydis exchanged a glance with Bjorn, both of them wondering how much the old woman truly knew. "We need your help, grandmother," Freydis said, using the respectful term reserved for the village's eldest and wisest. "We need you to speak truth before the council." Ragnhild's laugh was like wind through dry reeds. "Truth is a dangerous thing, child. Are you certain you want to hear it all?" "We want justice," Bjorn said firmly. "We want the freedom to choose our own path." "Justice," the wise woman repeated, tasting the word like bitter medicine. "Yes, there has been precious little of that in Hofstrand these past years. Come inside, both of you. What I have to tell you requires privacy." The cottage's interior was a maze of hanging herbs, ceramic pots, and shelves lined with objects whose purposes could only be guessed. The air thick with the scent of sage and something darker, something that spoke of hidden knowledge and forbidden truths. Ragnhild moved with surprising sureness through the cluttered space, finally settling into a chair that seemed to have been carved from a single massive root. She gestured for them to sit on the low stools nearby, her milky eyes fixed on some point between them that might have been the past or the future. "I have something that belongs to you," she said to Bjorn, reaching into the folds of her robe to withdraw a leather-wrapped bundle. "Something your father left in my keeping before he died." Bjorn's breath caught in his throat. His father, Skallgrim the Bold, had died when Bjorn was only 15, officially from a hunting accident, though the circumstances had always seemed strange to those who knew the man's skill in the wild. "My father came here?" he asked, accepting the bundle with hands that trembled slightly. "Often in his final months," Ragnhild confirmed. He suspected treachery, but couldn't prove it. He knew his time was running short and wanted to ensure the truth would survive him. With careful fingers, Bjorn unwrapped the leather to reveal a collection of items that made his heart race. A letter sealed with his father's personal mark, a small silver pendant that had belonged to his mother, and something that made him gasp aloud, a second letter bearing Thorvald's official seal. "Read the one from your father first," Ragnhild instructed. "Then you'll understand the significance of the other." Bjorn broke the seal with reverent care, unfolding parchment that crackled with age. His father's familiar handwriting, strong and decisive even in what must have been his final days, filled the page with words that would change everything. "My beloved son, if you read this, then my suspicions proved correct and I am beyond the reach of earthly enemies. Know that I died loving you and your mother's memory above all earthly things. Thorvald has grown corrupt with power, making alliances that serve his ambition rather than our people's welfare. He has promised your future bride to his son in exchange for support from the eastern villages, treating her like a piece in his political games. More damning still, he arranged my death to remove opposition to his plans. The hunting accident was no accident. I found the trap meant for me and barely escaped the first attempt. I write this knowing he will try again, and that my vigilance cannot last forever. In this bundle you will find proof of his treachery, a letter in his own hand, detailing the arrangement he made regarding Freydis Eriksdottir. I obtained it through means I cannot reveal without endangering others, but its authenticity cannot be questioned. Use this knowledge wisely, my son. Sometimes justice requires patience, and sometimes it demands immediate action. I trust your judgment to know which moment has arrived. Your loving father, Skallgrim the Bold." The letter fluttered from Bjorn's numb fingers as the full weight of revelation crashed over him. His father had been murdered. Thorvald was not merely a strict traditionalist, but a calculating killer. And Freydis opened the second letter. Ragnhild said gently, "You need to see the full scope of their conspiracy." With hands that shook with barely controlled rage, Bjorn broke Thorvald's seal and read words that filled him with cold fury. "To Jarl Magnus of Ironhold, I confirm our agreement regarding the marriage alliance between your granddaughter and my heir. Freydis Eriksdottir will wed Eirik Bloodaxe within 2 years of her 20th birthday, uniting our territories under a single authority as we discussed. The girl's preference in the matter is irrelevant. I have legal authority to arrange the match, and her father dares not oppose me directly. Should any interference arise from other suitors, it will be dealt with permanently. Skullgrim's son shows signs of attachment to the girl, but his departure for the eastern campaigns will resolve that complication. I have ensured he will remain abroad until the marriage is accomplished, and the alliance secured. Your partnership in these matters will be remembered when the time comes to redistribute territories and titles among our expanded holdings. Thorvald Ironbeard, chieftain of Hovstrand." The letter was dated 3 years past, shortly before Bjorn's departure for the wars that had kept him away far longer than originally planned. The implications hit him like physical blows. His absence had been deliberately orchestrated. Freydis had been bartered away like livestock, and his father had died trying to prevent it. "You understand now?" Ragnhild said, watching his face with those unseeing eyes that somehow saw too much. This was never about marriage customs or village harmony. It was about power, territory, and the elimination of anyone who might oppose their plans. Freydis had read the letters over his shoulder, her face pale with shock. "They killed your father," she whispered. "And they would have forced me to marry his murderer's son." "They still might," Bjorn said grimly, his warrior's mind already calculating possibilities and responses. "This evidence proves their guilt, but it also makes us dangerous to them." "Desperate men do desperate things," Ragnhild nodded approvingly. "Now you begin to see clearly. Thorvald cannot allow this matter to go to a fair council vote. Too many villagers suspected the truth about your father's death. He will try to end this another way." "What way?" Freydis asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Violence," the wise woman replied simply. "An attack that can be blamed on brigands or foreign raiders. An accident that removes the inconvenient witnesses to his crimes. He has done it before. He will not hesitate to do it again." Bjorn stood slowly, his massive frame radiating the controlled fury of a warrior who had found his cause. "Then we end this before he can act," he said, his voice carrying the iron certainty of a man who had made his choice. "We take this evidence to the village, reveal his crimes for all to see." "And if he denies it?" Ragnhild asked. "If he claims the letters are forgeries, the accusations lies, who will the village believe? Their chieftain of 20 years, or a warrior who has been gone for 5? It was a sobering question, one that highlighted the dangerous position they found themselves in. Truth was not always enough when power and fear held sway over men's hearts. "Then we make sure they have no choice but to believe," Freydis said quietly, her healer's mind finding clarity in the midst of crisis. "We gather witnesses, we present the evidence carefully, and we force Thorvald to respond before the entire village." Ragnhild smiled, the expression transforming her ancient face. "Now you think like your grandmother did, child." She too knew that sometimes the only way to fight corruption is to drag it into the light where all can see. But even as they planned their next moves, none of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the cottage wall and slipped away into the marsh mist. Eirik had followed them again, and this time he had heard enough to know that his father's carefully laid plans were in mortal danger. The ancestral sword of Skullgrim the Bold had hung above the mantel in Bjorn's childhood home for as long as memory served, its steel reflecting firelight like captured lightning. Now, as Bjorn lifted the weapon from its place of honor, the blade seemed to thrum with purpose, as if awakening from a long sleep to answer the call of justice denied too long. The sword was a masterwork of northern craftsmanship, its steel folded and hammered by smiths who understood that a warrior's blade was more than mere metal. It was an extension of his soul, a vessel for his honor, a legacy passed from father to son through generations of struggle and triumph. The grip, worn smooth by his father's hands, fit Bjorn's palm as if forged specifically for him. "He would have wanted you to carry it," Eric said quietly, watching from the doorway as Bjorn tested the weapon's weight and balance. The healer had come to find them after their return from Ragnhild's cottage. Drawn by the sense that momentous events were unfolding around them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, Bjorn nodded, sliding the sword into the leather scabbard that had also belonged to his father. "Before this night ends, it will taste the blood of his killers," he vowed, his voice carrying the grim certainty of a man who had crossed the line from seeking justice to demanding vengeance. Freydis watched this transformation with mixed emotions. She loved Bjorn's strength, his willingness to fight for what mattered, but she also feared what the violence might cost them both. "The letters are evidence enough," she said carefully. "We can expose Thorvald's crimes without bloodshed, can we?" Bjorn asked, turning to face her with eyes that held depths of shadow she had never seen before. "Eric was watching when we left Ragnhild's cottage. By now, Thorvald knows we have the proof of his treachery. Do you think he'll simply confess and submit to justice?" The question hung heavy in the air. All three of them understood the implications. Cornered wolves were the most dangerous of all beasts, and Thorvald had too much to lose to surrender without a fight. "What do you propose?" Eric asked, his healer's mind already calculating the likely casualties of whatever plan his young friend was forming. Bjorn moved to the window, peering out at the village that bustled with unusual activity. Word of the evening's final council session had spread quickly, and people were gathering in excited clusters, their voices carrying the electric anticipation that preceded momentous events. "We present the evidence publicly," he said finally. "Not in the closed council chamber where Thorvald can control the narrative, but in the open square where every villager can see and judge for themselves." "That's against protocol," Eric pointed out. "The council meets privately to deliberate serious matters. Protocol serves those who have something to hide," Freydis observed, understanding dawning in her voice. "Bjorn is right. We need witnesses, as many as possible. Thorvald can intimidate or silence a few council members, but he can't murder an entire village." "Don't be so certain of that," a new voice said from the doorway. They turned to see Sigrid entering with urgent haste, her face flushed from running. "Our men are gathering at the longhouse. Strangers, warriors from the eastern villages who came in just after dawn." Bjorn's jaw tightened as the pieces fell into place. "Jarl Magnus's men," he concluded. "Thorvald is calling in his allies, preparing for war rather than justice." "How many?" he asked, his tactical mind automatically assessing the threat. 24 that I counted," Sigrid reported. "Maybe more still arriving. They're well armed and disciplined, not common brigands or local troublemakers." The numbers were sobering. Even with Bjorn's legendary skills, facing such odds would likely mean death for all of them. But retreat was no longer an option. Too much had been set in motion, too many secrets exposed. "We need allies of our own," Freydis said, her mind racing through possibilities. "Who in the village would stand with us against Thorvald?" Eric stroked his beard thoughtfully. "More than you might think," he said slowly. "Your father wasn't the only one who suspected the truth about Skallgrim's death. And there are others who've grown tired of Thorvald's increasingly heavy hand. Gunnar the Overseer has always been an honest man," Sigrid added. "He carried out the whipping because law demanded it, but I saw his face when Bjorn stopped it. He was relieved. The younger families, especially those with daughters," Freydis suggested. "They understand what forced marriage means, even if they've never spoken against it openly." Bjorn nodded, seeing the wisdom in building a coalition rather than facing their enemies alone. "We divide our efforts," he decided. "Freydis, you and Sigrid go to the women. Show them what Thorvald's letter really says about treating daughters like property to be traded. Eric, speak to the men who knew my father, who remember him as an honorable warrior. I'll find the younger fighters who might be willing to stand against corruption, and if Thorvald strikes first..." Eric asked. "If he decides to end this with steel rather than words." Bjorn's hand moved instinctively to his father's sword. "Then we'll be ready," he said simply. "But we don't start the violence. We defend ourselves and protect what we love." The next few hours passed in a blur of careful movement and whispered conversations. Freydis found the village women surprisingly receptive to her message, their anger kindling as they learned how Thorvald had arranged to sell her like livestock while claiming to uphold their sacred traditions. Many had daughters of their own, and the thought of their children suffering similar fates proved a powerful motivator. Eric's mission among the older men proved equally successful. Skallgrim the Bold had been widely respected, and many had harbored private suspicions about the circumstances of his death. When presented with evidence of murder and conspiracy, their doubts crystallized into righteous fury. Bjorn's task was perhaps the most crucial, convincing the village's young warriors to risk their lives in open defiance of their chieftain. But many of these men had grown up hearing tales of his exploits in foreign lands, and his reputation as the bone crusher carried weight that even Thorvald's authority could not match. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across Hovstrand, the three conspirators reconvened in Eric's dwelling to assess their progress. 18 households have pledged their support, Freydis reported, her eyes bright with hope and determination, including some I never expected. Astrid, the blacksmith's wife, changed her mind completely when she learned about the conspiracy. 23 men willing to stand with us in open confrontation, Eric added. Not all young fighters, but all good men who remember what honor means. Bjorn's count was smaller, but perhaps more significant. 7 warriors sworn to follow my lead, including Olaf Ironside and young Magnus, whose father died in the Eastern campaigns. Not many, but skilled and utterly committed. The numbers were still daunting when weighed against Thorvald's forces, but they represented something more important than mere fighting strength. They showed that the village was fracturing along lines of principle rather than mere politics. "There's something else," Freydis said, producing a small leather pouch from her healing bag. "Ragnhild gave me this before we left her cottage. She said I would know when to use it." She opened the pouch to reveal a collection of small clay tablets, each marked with symbols that seemed to glow with inner fire in the lamplight. Ancient runes of binding and truth-telling, the kind used in the old rituals when the gods themselves were called upon to judge the guilty. "Truth stones," Eric breathed, recognizing their significance. "I haven't seen their like since my grandfather's time. They're said to compel honesty from any who touch them, to make lies burn like poison on a speaker's tongue. Do you believe such things still hold power?" Bjorn asked, his practical warrior's mind skeptical of mystical solutions. "I believe," Freydis said firmly, "that Thorvald believes. And that may be enough to force his hand into the open where justice can reach him." As darkness settled over Hovstrand like a shroud, the village prepared for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of 2 lovers, but the very nature of justice and freedom in their small corner of the world. In the Longhouse, Thorvald and his allies planned strategies of intimidation and violence. In scattered homes throughout the village, ordinary people prepared to risk everything for the radical idea that truth mattered more than tradition, that love deserved protection even when it challenged authority. And in the sacred grove where it all began, the ancient runestone stood silent witness to the gathering storm, its carved symbols seeming to pulse with anticipation as the gods themselves prepared to judge the worthiness of mortal hearts. The bronze village bell that had summoned Hovstrand's people to assembly for 3 generations rang out across the evening air with urgent authority, its deep voice carrying farther than any human call. The bell hung in the tower beside the longhouse, its surface green with age, but its voice still strong enough to reach every corner of the settlement and the surrounding farmsteads. Tonight, however, the bell's summons carried an edge of desperation that had never marked its tone before. 3 sharp peals, a pause, Then three more, the ancient signal for emergency assembly when danger threatened the entire community. Every soul in Hovstrand understood its meaning, and they came running through the gathering dusk with questions on their lips and fear in their hearts. The village square filled quickly with people carrying torches and oil lamps, their flickering flames creating a constellation of light that pushed back the darkness. Mothers clutched children close, while fathers checked weapons that hadn't been drawn in anger for years. The air hummed with nervous energy and whispered speculation about what crisis could require such urgent gathering. Thorvald Ironbeard emerged from the longhouse with ceremonial bearing, flanked by his son Eirik and the foreign warriors who had arrived that morning. The chieftain wore his finest mail shirt and his father's ceremonial helm, while the sword at his hip gleamed with fresh oil and sharpening. Everything about his appearance declared that this was no ordinary council session. This was a moment when leadership would be tested by steel if necessary. "People of Hovstrand," Thorvald called, his voice carrying easily across the packed square. "We gather tonight to address a threat to our very survival, not from foreign raiders or natural disaster, but from corruption that has taken root in our own midst." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as villagers exchanged confused glances. Many had expected to hear judgment in the matter of Freydis and the competing marriage claims, not accusations of corruption. "A man has returned to our village," Thorvald continued, his pale eyes finding Bjorn in the crowd, bringing with him lies and forgeries designed to overthrow lawful authority. He speaks of ancient pledges and secret promises, but his true purpose is to sow discord and weaken our unity. Bjorn stepped forward from among his supporters, his father's sword hanging openly at his side. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a longship, and he walked with the measured pace of a man who had faced death in a dozen battles without flinching. "I bring no lies," he declared, his voice ringing clear across the square. "Only truth that has been hidden too long in darkness." He reached into his travel pack and withdrew the letters that Ragnhild had preserved, holding them high so all could see. Truth written in Thorvald's own hand, sealed with his own mark, revealing crimes that cry out for justice. Eric's hand moved to his sword hilt, but his father restrained him with a subtle gesture. This confrontation required careful handling. Too much haste would expose their desperation to the watching villagers. "Forgeries," Thorvald scoffed, though his eyes never left the letters. "Documents that any skilled scribe could create to support false accusations. Will you trust the word of a foreign mercenary over your lawful chieftain?" "Then let the documents speak for themselves," Freydis called out. Stepping from the crowd to stand beside Bjorn, she carried one of Ragnhild's truth stones in her palm, its ancient runes seeming to glow in the torchlight. "Let any who doubt their authenticity touch this stone of truth while examining them. The old gods will judge who speaks honestly." The challenge sent a visible shudder through the assembled crowd. Truth stones were legendary artifacts, mentioned in the oldest sagas, but rarely seen in modern times. Their power to compel honesty was questioned by some, but none were willing to test that skepticism against forces older than memory. Eric the Wise pushed forward to support his daughter, carrying a torch that illuminated the clay tablet in her hand. "The wise woman Ragnhild sends this token from the sacred grove," he announced. "She who has walked among us for 70 winters, who has never spoken false prophecy or given counsel that led good people astray." Thorvald's face darkened at the mention of Ragnhild. The old woman was beyond his authority to silence, protected by age and reputation that made her nearly untouchable. Her endorsement of their accusations carried weight that no amount of political maneuvering could counter. "Superstition and trickery," the chieftain declared, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I will not subject myself to pagan rituals that have no place in a Christian village." The dismissal rang false to many ears. Hovstrand had always walked carefully between the old faith and the new, honoring both the Christ and the gods of their ancestors. To reject the truth stone so quickly, suggested fear rather than righteous indignation. Bjorn seized the moment of uncertainty. "If you fear the touch of truth, Thorvald Ironbeard, then let the letters speak without mystical aid." He unfolded the first document, his father's final testimony, and began to read aloud the words that detailed betrayal and murder. His voice carried clearly across the silent square, each revelation striking the assembled villagers like physical blows. The conspiracy, the arranged marriage, the deliberate murder of Skullgrim the Bold, each crime, exposed in careful detail that painted a picture of corruption reaching to the very heart of their community's leadership. When he finished reading his father's letter, the silence stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. The silence shattered as Eric Bloodaxe drew his sword with a ring of steel that cut through the evening air like lightning. "Enough of these lies," he roared, his handsome face twisted with rage and desperation. "I will not stand here while foreign dogs slander my father with fabricated tales." But even as his blade cleared its scabbard, his eyes were fixed not on Bjorn, but on Freydis, who stood exposed in the center of the square, with only the healer's knife at her belt for protection. The small blade was designed for delicate surgical work, not battle, yet she gripped it with steady hands as Eric advanced on her with murder in his pale eyes. "If I cannot have you," he snarled, "then no one will." The coward's choice, to strike at the helpless rather than face a warrior's blade, revealed Eric's true nature to every watching villager. Several gasped in shock as they saw their future chieftains. Ere abandon all pretense of honor in favor of brutal expedience, Bjorn moved with the fluid grace of a man who had survived countless battles by trusting his instincts. His father's sword sang from its scabbard, the ancient steel gleaming as it caught the torchlight. But Eirik had positioned himself cleverly, using the crowd as a barrier that forced Bjorn to circle wide while keeping Freydis within easy striking distance. "Stand back, all of you," Thorvald commanded, his own weapon drawn as his foreign allies spread out to control the square. "This matter will be settled with steel, as our ancestors intended." The villagers pressed back against the edges of the square, but many refused to flee entirely. They had come to witness justice, and justice could not be served if honest folk abandoned the field to corruption and violence. Eric stepped protectively in front of his daughter, his healer's hands empty of weapons, but his courage undaunted. "You will not touch her while I draw breath," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had delivered half the village and tended their wounds through plague and famine. Eric's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "An old man and a woman against a warrior's blade. Stand aside, healer, and perhaps I'll grant you the mercy of a quick death." "The only quick death here will be yours," Bjorn growled, finally clearing the press of bodies to face his enemy directly. His massive frame seemed to radiate controlled violence as he settled into the fighting stance that had made him legendary across the Eastern Kingdoms. But Thorvald was not finished with his desperate gambit. "Kill them all," he commanded his foreign warriors. "Let no witness survive to spread these lies." The order revealed the depths of his corruption more clearly than any letter could have managed. To murder an entire village to preserve his secrets marked him as a tyrant beyond redemption, and several of his own men hesitated at such a monstrous command. That hesitation cost them dearly as Bjorn's allies finally revealed themselves. Gunnar the Overseer stepped from the crowd with his whip replaced by a battle-axe, his scarred face grim with purpose. Young Magnus and the other warriors who had pledged their loyalty emerged from concealment among the villagers, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight. "For Skullgrim the Bold," Bjorn roared, his father's name becoming a battle cry that echoed across the square. "For justice and truth." The clash of steel rang out like thunder as 24 warriors met in savage combat. Bjorn's legendary skills proved their worth as he carved through foreign fighters with methodical precision, each stroke of his father's blade carrying the weight of righteous vengeance. But the battle's turning point came from an unexpected source. As Eirik lunged toward Freydis with murder in his eyes, she did not retreat or cower as he expected. Instead, she stepped forward to meet his charge, her healer's knife flashing upward in a precise arc that caught him beneath his extended sword arm. The small blade was sharp enough to part flesh and found the gap in his mail where arm met torso. It was not a mortal wound, but the shock and pain caused Eric to stumble, his own sword wavering as he struggled to maintain his balance. In that moment of vulnerability, Bjorn's massive fist connected with Eric's jaw, a blow that lifted the younger man from his feet and sent him crashing into the wooden platform where the village elders normally sat in judgment. He did not rise again. Thorvald, seeing his son fall and his foreign allies overwhelmed by the righteous fury of Hovstrand's people, made one final desperate choice. Rather than surrender or flee, he charged directly at Freydis with his sword raised high, seeking to claim at least one victory from the ruins of his conspiracy. He never reached her. Bjorn intercepted the attack with a crossblock that shattered the older man's blade, then followed through with a strike that opened Thorvald's throat to the evening air. The corrupt chieftain fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, his blood pooling in the dust where justice had finally found its mark. The square fell silent, except for the groans of wounded men and the ragged breathing of those who had survived. In the flickering torchlight, the village bell continued to ring, its bronze voice now celebrating victory rather than summoning aid. 3 weeks after the night of blood and justice in Hovstrand Square, the village smith's forge rang with a different kind of purpose. Where once iron had been shaped into weapons and tools of labor, now it sang with the creation of something altogether more precious, 2 simple bands of silver that would bind hearts already joined by choice and consecrated by struggle. The new wedding rings gleamed in the forge light as the smith added the final touches, their surfaces smooth and unadorned, save for the small runes of protection and blessing that honored both the old gods and the new faith. They were modest, compared to the gaudy silver arm ring that had once symbolized Eric's arrogant pursuit, but their very simplicity spoke of love that needed no ornamentation to declare its worth. Freydis watched the final preparations from beside the great hearth in what had once been Thorvald's longhouse and now served as the temporary seat of village governance. The building felt different with the corruption purged from it, lighter, somehow as if the very stones had been cleansed of the malice that had festered within their walls for too many years. "Are you nervous?" asked Sigrid, arranging the simple circlet of wildflowers that would serve as Freydis's bridal crown. The blooms had been gathered from the sacred grove that morning, their petals still kissed with dew and their stems intertwined with ribbons that had belonged to her mother. "Not nervous," Freydis replied thoughtfully, touching the iron ring on her right hand that had once belonged to her mother. "Grateful. After so many years of uncertainty, of fighting for the right to choose my own path, it feels almost too wonderful to believe." Through the open windows, they could hear the sounds of celebration beginning to build throughout the village. Tables were being arranged in the square where blood had so recently been spilled, and the scents of roasting meat and baking bread filled the air with promises of feast and fellowship. The transformation of Hovstrand had been remarkable to witness. With Thorvald dead and Eirik exiled to distant shores with nothing but the clothes on his back, the village had come together to choose new leadership through genuine consent rather than inherited authority. Gunnar the Overseer, respected for his fairness and honesty, had been elected as temporary chieftain until more permanent arrangements could be made. But more significant than the change in leadership was the shift in the village's very soul. The revelation of Thorvald's crimes had awakened something in the people, a recognition that authority derived its legitimacy from service rather than force. That tradition was meant to protect the innocent rather than empower the corrupt. Other changes followed naturally. Young couples who had been pressured into unwanted matches found the courage to speak their hearts. Daughters whose fathers had planned their futures without consulting their wishes discovered that their voices carried new weight in family councils. The village's women, inspired by Freydis's example, began taking more active roles in community decisions that affected their lives and their children's futures. Eric entered the longhouse carrying his healer's bag, his weathered face bright with the satisfaction of a man who had seen justice triumph over corruption. "The last of the wounded are healing well," he reported. "Even young Olaf, who took that sword thrust to the shoulder, should be able to dance at the wedding feast tonight." "And the families of those who fell?" Freydis asked, her healer's heart still tender for those who had paid the ultimate price for justice. "Provided for," Eric assured her. "The village voted unanimously to support the widows and orphans from the common treasury. It's the least we can do for men who died defending our freedom." Bjorn appeared in the doorway, his massive frame somehow managing to move with quiet grace, despite the ceremonial armor he wore for the occasion. The mail shirt had belonged to his father, lovingly cleaned and mended, while the sword at his side bore fresh runes of peace to balance its history of necessary violence. "The priest is ready," he announced, referring to the traveling holy man who had arrived just in time to perform the ceremony, "as are the village elders who will witness our vows before both the Christian God and the old gods of our ancestors." The blending of faiths had been another of the village's new accommodations, a recognition that wisdom could be found in many traditions, that the sacred could not be contained within any single set of beliefs or customs. Freydis rose and smoothed her wedding dress, a gown of deep blue wool embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like captured starlight. It had been her grandmother's dress, preserved in sweet herbs for decades and altered to fit her frame. Wearing it made her feel connected to all the women who had loved and been loved in this place, all the hearts that had chosen courage over convention. "Are you ready?" Bjorn asked gently, offering his arm with the same care he had shown when helping her down from the punishment post, what seemed like a lifetime ago. "I've been ready for 5 years," she replied, with a smile that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "But yes, I'm ready to begin our new life together." As they walked toward the square where their friends and neighbors waited, Freydis reflected on the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. Pain and separation, conspiracy and violence, the near loss of everything they held dear, yet somehow those trials had only strengthened their bond and proven the depth of their commitment. The wedding ceremony itself was simple but profound, combining the ancient rituals of their people with the newer traditions of Christian marriage. When they exchanged the silver rings, forged specifically for this moment, the entire village erupted in cheers that seemed to carry across the fjord and up into the mountains, where the gods themselves might hear and approve. As night fell, and the celebration continued around great bonfires that painted the sky with sparks and laughter, Bjorn and Freydis found themselves standing once again in the sacred grove where their love had first been pledged. The runestone stood silent and ancient in the moonlight, its carved symbols seeming to pulse with gentle approval. "What do you think lies ahead for us?" Freydis asked, her hand warm in his as they stood beneath the same oak trees that had sheltered their childhood promises. "I think," Bjorn replied, pulling her close against his chest, "that we've learned the most important truth of all, that love, freely chosen and bravely defended, can overcome any obstacle, change any custom, and transform any community willing to embrace justice over tradition." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, witness to another love story that had found its happy ending through courage, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that some things, love, honor, truth, were worth any price required to preserve them. In Hovstrand, the village bell rang out across the night, no longer summoning people to crisis or judgment, but celebrating the triumph of hearts that had chosen each other against all odds and proven that sometimes, just sometimes, love really could conquer all.